All right, Miss Jamie Davis, welcome to the Help for Men podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you working out of? Is it North Carolina?
Yep, I am in Raleigh, North Carolina. I am a family law attorney. I've been practicing for, gosh, I think it's 23 years this year.
Oh,
I am the
wow.
co-managing partner of Gaylor Hunt Davis Taylor and Gibbs in Raleigh, and I am a board certified family law specialist.
Family law specialist. Is this a specialty that doesn't have how do we put this? Your future is probably good, I would assume, as a family law specialist. You don't see that going away anytime soon, do you?
Unfortunately, no, divorce seems to be a part of life. When times are good, folks get divorced, and when times are bad, seems like more folks are getting divorced.
Do you see a trend going one way or the other right now? Over the last, you've been at this for 20 some odd years, so you've seen the trends come and go. What do you see going on right now?
It seems to be pretty stable. We saw an uptick during COVID and just following COVID, and things seem to have calmed down a bit and are going back to where they were pre-pandemic.
Okay. How about societal trends overall, like now versus 20 some years ago? Do we see, like, for example, do we see more men now filing versus women, or is it flip flopped, or is it pretty even from what you've seen?
Couple of trends that I've noticed. There seem to be more women, I think, pursuing divorce than there were, let's say, 20 years ago.
Mhm.
Also, there has been a huge uptick in what we call gray divorce, and that's divorce for folks who are generally over 55 years of age.
And what do you see as being the genesis of the gray divorce? Is that as a result of kids are officially out of the house and on their own? Now we can relax, and I realize, oh, I don't like this one over here that much anymore.
No, I think it's really, people are living longer and they are staying healthier for longer. And they've gotten to a point in their life where they're like, hey, I've still got a lot of years left to live and I really want to be happy in my golden years. And so they're choosing to go in a different direction.
Where my mind initially goes to with that scenario is, and this is a biased perspective as a man, but I hear this often, is the 50-some-year-old guy who in his mind he's still got it going on. He's doing the testosterone and he's acting like a 20 some odd year old or whatever, and his wife, and God bless her, is this postmenopausal average gal who's like, I can't necessarily keep up with this guy and his energy. And we have a lot of men in our group that are dealing with what we call dead bedroom situations, where the sexual interest is very much mismatched in the relationship, and we see that being the driver for a lot of separation and divorce. Do you see that a lot in your practice?
So we see some, absolutely. That can certainly be a reason. I think there can be lots of reasons. Like I said, we've
Mm.
actually seen an increase in the number of women filing for divorce, which I think is interesting. And I don't think it's necessarily the cliche midlife crisis that's driving it. I think it's just, folks are deciding they want to go in a different direction.
Interesting. Yeah, we see nationwide, I think the stats are showing that it's around 70% of the divorce filings are done by women, which always kind of blows people away. Like, wow, I didn't see
Yeah.
that coming. But what we see is also how much the stats are skewed by when the lady in the relationship is well to do financially. She can take care of herself financially, career wise. Do you see that having an impact on the divorce numbers in your practice as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, with money comes power and options, right? And so,
Mm.
whereas a spouse may have had to stay in a relationship before if they didn't have the resources to go out on their own, if they do have those resources, then they're able to make the decision that's right for them emotionally without having to worry so much about the finances.
Yeah, what that brings to light an uncomfortable little factoid for a lot of people, which is, people will often say, my grandma and great grandma, they never even thought about divorce. They were, together for 40, 50, 60 years with grandpa. And I was like, well, in a lot of those cases, grandma didn't have much of a choice.
Right.
She was under, if not unemployed, and no education and and so she was quote unquote forced to work it out and stick it out in what sometimes was a very unhealthy relationship. And we see that the tables are turning. The old scales are tipping in the other direction with a lot of our gals out there, much like yourself, well-to-do career people having their own business, own practices. We see a lot of attorneys and accountants and doctors and so forth, and they're saying, "What exactly am I doing in this relationship with this guy? We've grown apart, and I don't quote need him anymore." It's heartbreaking, but we see that's the genesis of a lot of these breakups, unfortunately. But we're talking about the world of family law, and that's a whole different ball of wax there. And that's something that a lot of the men listening to this have experience with, unfortunately. And a predominant message that we see from a lot of guys, I post a lot of content online, a lot of videos and so forth. And if it has anything to do with divorce, you'll have a lot of guys in the comments saying, "This is my experience," in not so nice language. And the predominant theme, at least let's be honest, amongst the more vocal guys, is, "I'm a man. We just traditionally get screwed over in the family law courts." That the court says, man down here, woman up here, as far as the hierarchy of who gets the kids, who gets the money, and so forth. Have you seen that over the years? And if so, do you see it getting better? Or are the scales tipping in the other direction, a more even, fair balance?
Yeah, so that is a great question. I will say, at least in Wake County, North Carolina, where I practice, that is very much not the case, especially when it comes to child custody. Our judges tend to lean toward a 50-50 custody schedule, and if that's what both parents want. Obviously, if one parent doesn't want 50-50, we're talking about something else. But if both folks want a 50-50 schedule, and that's what they're seeking, our judges are tending to lean that way unless there is some compelling reason why 50-50 is not in the best interest of the child.
Was that the case like 10 years ago? Or do you see this being a recent development, or that's always kind of been the case?
I will say, when I first started practicing 20 some years ago, things were a little bit different. You would have more cases where one parent or the other may have primary custody. And usually in those cases, that parent was the mom. But that certainly is not the norm anymore, at least where I practice.
Do you see we see a trend with stay-at-home fathers becoming more and more of a common thing, with the wives having the money-making career and the husband's like, "Well, it doesn't make sense for me to go to my lower paying job. I'll stay home with the children and take care of the home and everything." What impact does that have for those guys that are listening to this, that are stay-at-home fathers, and they're seeing divorce, at the other, the light at the end of the tunnel is divorce. What do they have to look forward to? Is this something that the judges typically look down upon? Here is an unemployed father who wants 50-50 custody of the kids. How is he going to take care of them? Getting money from mother for child support and so forth. How do you see that playing out?
I mean, so our laws tend to be fairly gender neutral.
Okay, good.
A dependent spouse is a dependent spouse, can be male,
Mm-hmm.
female, doesn't matter. To get alimony in North Carolina, you have to be a dependent spouse, and the other spouse has to be a supporting spouse. An award of alimony needs to be equitable given the circumstances. And really, it boils down to a financial analysis. Does the dependent spouse have enough funds to meet their monthly bills? Taking into consideration any net income that they bring home, any child support that they might receive from the other parent. And if the answer is no, they don't have enough money, then you look at the income and expenses of the supporting spouse and say, okay, once supporting spouse pays their reasonable bills, pays their child support obligation, do they have enough money left to pay alimony to the other spouse? And if the answer is yes, then there's probably going to be some amount of alimony for some period of time. The interesting thing here in North Carolina is that we don't have a formula for how that's calculated. It really is up to the lawyers to argue to the court what amount of alimony is reasonable and for what period of time. We typically see alimony awards for a duration of somewhere around half the length of the marriage. There is no rule that has to be the case, but that's typically what we see.
I see. And it's interesting. First question that comes to mind is, what sway does a judge have in these matters? And I ask this because, let me give you a personal little anecdote of mine. To make a long story short, was with an attorney after the divorce cleared and everything else. And I was sitting down with them, and they say, given the schedule of how often you have your children, Ralph, your ex should be paying you child support. This is within your legal right to request that. Is that something you want to pursue? And I was like, I don't know. And then she said, well, hold on a second. She goes, who was the judge on your divorce? I was like, I don't remember. So she looked at the paperwork. She was, oh yeah, Judge Smith or whatever it was. She likes dads, so you'd be in good shape. And I thought, that's odd that something subjective like that, like it's a judge, she likes dads, you'd be in good shape. I just thought it would be a matter of like, ones and zeros, the law. Like it's just, but in North Carolina, in your practice, do you look at, let's see who the judge is, and that will kind of dictate the direction of this? How much sway do they have?
Not really. And, even if that were the case, here in Wake County, we have what's called family court. And that means your judge is assigned to your case. And so the lawyers have no discretion at all about who is going to hear the case. When it comes to child support, we have child support guidelines. And so for folks whose combined gross incomes are less than $480,000 a year, those guidelines are going to apply. And really, you're putting numbers into a calculator, mom's income, dad's income, the number of overnights the kids are with each parent, who's paying the children's health insurance and how much. Is there any work-related childcare expense, et cetera? In some cases, there are some extraordinary expenses that can be included. And that calculator is going to spit out a number. Sometimes we do have the discussion with the client if it's a very small number. Let's say it's nominal child support, maybe a couple $100s a month or something like that. Is it cost effective for the client to pursue that if the other parent is not going to agree and we're going to have a court hearing? I think that's a very different type of analysis, though. I certainly don't think it boils down to, the judge having sway in that regard.
Gotcha. So when talking about, okay, I'm a man, I'm going into the family court, mediation failed for whatever reason, let's take this to court. Let's do this the old-fashioned way, as they say. And do you see, what are some big mistakes that you see a lot of men making when they come into that family court, ready to duke it out, so to speak, with the ex and figure out who gets what custody, who gets what, assets and debts and so forth? Are there big mistakes that you see a lot of men making that we can share with our audience? Cross your T's and dot your I's type of thing?
So I think one mistake that I see, it's prevalent with the business owner dad. Dad has his own company. He controls his income. He's making all the major decisions for the business. And right before court, he decides to change how much he's paid or how he's paid or how often he's paid. That's a real big no-no. Even if there is a legitimate reason for doing it, it looks bad. It looks like you're doing some sort of divorce planning and trying to get your income in a better place for child support and alimony calculations. So I would say if you are a business owner dad and that is something you are considering, I would highly encourage you to talk to an attorney first before you do that. Likewise, if your business is going to go in a different direction, if you're considering an acquisition or some big business expense that is not a routine, ordinary, something that you would normally just do in the course of business, talk to your lawyer first. Make sure it's not going to negatively impact your case. I think those are two of the big things that we see a lot. Another thing when it comes to custody, think about what you really want for custody. Do you want 50-50 custody? And if you do, put yourself in a positive light to get 50-50 custody. Make sure that you are being as involved with the children as you can be and as you want to be. Go to their events, go to their parent-teacher conferences, go to all of the things, and don't let your child's other parent make you feel like you can't do that, because you have every right to be at those events as well. Be involved in the doctor visits. It is not uncommon that during a marriage, spouses establish different roles. Maybe one parent is primarily responsible for making all the kid appointments. Maybe they deal with the doctor's visits and the parent-teacher conferences and all the things. But when you're getting separated and going through a divorce and dealing with child custody, it's very important, if you want equal time with your children, that you become at least equally involved in those things.
And one of those things that may be a little uncomfortable for some men, especially my more blue collar guys out there listening to this, is that some of them work nights. I go in at midnight and I'm done at 6 a.m., 8 a.m., whatever it is. I'm like, That's not going to cut it, my man. Not if you want to do 50-50 custody with your kiddos. The judge or whoever's going to say, oh, you work midnight to 8. You can't take care of a child half the time. So it may be, let's go back to the drawing board and look at the career thing. Go back to the boss and say, can I work a traditional shift or complete career change? And that's a lot for guys to take on during all of this upheaval with the divorce and everything. Just adds to the stress of the situation. But you got to face reality. That's what it is. And if you want the 50-50 custody, you have to show the judge and everyone else that you have the ability to be just as good of a, what do you call it, a custodial parent and co-parent in all of this and do all of those parenting things that you just mentioned, which often, let's be honest here, guys, often the women in our lives are the logistical managers of the family. More often than not, that's what I hear. My wife takes them to the doctor. My wife goes to the PTO meetings. My wife makes the cookies for the bake sale and everything else. I coach the teams and mow the yard and do it. We have our roles, but so you're right. A lot of guys, you have to come to terms with the fact that you're going to take on those roles as well now. So it's a major upheaval for a lot of guys. And you've said it there several times. Consult with your attorney, consult with your attorney, consult with your attorney. That's my typical language that comes out of my mouth when I have a guy that comes to me via some direct message on Facebook or something and starts asking me legal questions. And I often say it is so different state to state, and you tell me if that's true. Are the laws just so wildly different state to state, county to county, that somebody from Alaska contacts you and asks you for legal advice? Do you just put your hands up and say, I'm sorry, I don't know about what's going on in Alaska? Do you give general advice that's applicable to any state? Or how does that work exactly?
Yeah, the states are very different. They can be very different. And lawyers are typically only licensed in a state. Some are licensed in more than one state, maybe surrounding areas and whatnot. But the safest course of action is to always consult with an attorney who is licensed in your particular state of residence.
And then it gets even more complicated when we're talking about different countries.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get those guys from the UK reaching out to me like, I have no clue.
Yeah.
You have to get with your solicitor, as they say over there. It's a totally different ball game. So when talking about the family law, right off the bat, do you want to avoid going to the family law court if at all possible? Are there downsides to going into what we call mediation and just doing it at a table, face to face outside of the courtroom?
So I highly recommend mediation as a way to resolve family law cases. I find it to be very, very effective. And I always tell my clients that you and your child's other parent are the two best people in the world to make decisions for your child. No judge is going to be able to spend an amount of time with your family where they get to understand the nuances of the things that will work for your family. Court dockets are crowded, hearing times can be limited. And with mediation or just trying to settle your matter outside of court, you can be more creative. You made a great point earlier about dads who work nights and maybe have a schedule that's not conducive to 50-50 custody. If you can settle your case outside of court, you can try to be creative with those types of work schedules to maximize custodial time for the parent that does have a non-traditional work schedule. We see it a lot with firefighters, policemen, folks who work, maybe 24-hour shifts and then have a few days off in a row. And so you can create a much more nuanced custody schedule if you're at a mediation table trying to work it out with your child's other parent.
Because once you go in front of a judge, it tends to be much more regimented in the doling out of who gets what. The nuance is gone.
There is just not the amount of time usually to bring the level of detail in front of the court that the court would need to make some of these more, again, detailed provisions. I mean, a basic custodial schedule, sure. Is a judge going to understand that dad is a firefighter and he works, 3 days in a row and then he's off for 4 days? Yeah, of course. I mean, a judge could help build a schedule around that, but maybe there's some, smaller things. Maybe you have a child who is particularly attached to one parent or the other, and maybe you need some touch points with that child, when the child is with the other parent. If you are trying to settle the issue, then you can build in some of those types of provisions.
Gotcha. Now, some of the guys listening to this, I attract a certain subset of guys to my material for whatever reason. I don't know if you're aware of this. We have guys that are the guys that listen to me commonly have what's known as ADHD. And ADHD guys, for whatever reason, tend to be more often than not entrepreneurial. Kind of an interesting little side note. So a lot of
Yeah.
you'll even see it with a lot of your CEO types and even in big corporations that don't necessarily have to be the owner, but it seems like the higher up you get and the more decision making 30,000 foot level guy, they all seem to have ADHD. I don't know what it is about that. So we're talking to probably a lot of guys that are entrepreneurial business owner types. And when they're going through, and you alluded to it earlier, when they're going through this whole breakup divorce process, it's a little different than if you're just a regular 9 to 5 Joe. What are some big key points that some of these guys need to keep in mind when going down this road that the 9 to 5 guy may not necessarily run into?
So I think there are several. From a business standpoint, lots of self-employed folks don't necessarily have the best business books. The accounting may be a little, creative. When you are going to go through a divorce, your finances are going to be on display. And so if you have not gotten your business books in order before going through the process, is a great time to get with a CPA and start getting that stuff in order, since you're going to need to produce those documents most likely to the other side. Also, if you have a bigger enterprise that you think is potentially going to need to be valued as part of the property distribution, you may want to start asking around, and you can start with your attorney. It's a great place to start about, hey, what experts are out there that we might want to help us with the valuation of this business. The good experts can get taken quickly and become conflicted out. And so if there is a particular expert your attorney routinely works with, you want to go ahead and get those folks on board sooner rather than later. When it comes to custodial issues, go ahead and think about what sort of childcare arrangements you're going to need. Let's say you get your ideal schedule. Well, you're probably going to need some sort of childcare. Usually, the court is going to expect each parent to be responsible for their own childcare and not rely on the other parent to do that. And so, think, okay, am I going to need, a nanny or a babysitter or somebody to pick my kids up from school? Am I going to need help in the morning? We have plenty of doctor clients who, they've got really early mornings and they might need a childcare provider in the morning to help get the kids out the door for school. And that's okay, right? Like if you have childcare in place, a court is not going to fault you for your work schedule if you can make arrangements for the children to get them where they need to be. If you are in control of your business travel, if you have that luxury that you can say, hey, I'm not going to travel as much right now, I need to focus on my family, maybe you cut back on that business travel for a bit so that you can spend more time with the kids and provide them that stability they need.
And that's tough for a lot of guys because we are so hyper focused on our business, and we have this mission in mind. I have to get this project done and that project done, and I'm buying this thing and I'm selling this thing, and et cetera. And then all of a sudden, this is thrown in our lap. More often than not, it's our lady saying, I want a divorce. And this throws everything for a loop. And yeah, it takes a big fat time out to say it's time to prioritize. You don't have to work on that project right now. The project can wait a month or two while you're busy assembling all this stuff for the CPA that you mentioned, with the books being out of order. I can relate to that. And, and everything else. And really taking inventory of everything and saying, where am I right now? What am I able to do? What am I not able to do? Let's be honest. I would love to say I want majority custody of my children, but is that realistic? Number one. And number two, are you really able to get majority custody of your children? We have, as you know better than anyone, it's such an emotion-laden thing that's going through this process that it clouds your judgment. And you make all these proclamations, I'm going to get 100% custody of my children. And I always ask men, what in the world makes you think that's going to happen? Well, my wife cheated on me. You'll hear that sometimes. Like, that has no bearing on anything. She's still a good mother. Just because she slept around with somebody else has no bearing on anything. The judge is just going to look at you and say, that goes to the question that you hear about some states are at fault and everything else. For those men listening to this, and it's a lot of them, where they've discovered infidelity and so forth, in your experience, does that have any bearing on anything in the whole litigation process, if that's the proper term to use here?
So we run into that a lot. In North Carolina, marital misconduct, adultery, cheating, whatever you want to call it, is relevant to alimony. In North
Interesting.
Carolina, if you are the dependent spouse and you commit adultery, you are barred from seeking alimony.
Wow.
Likewise, if you're the supporting spouse and you commit adultery, our statute is punitive and it reads, you shall pay alimony. I mean, what that means, of course, is up to the discretion of the judge. Does it mean maybe you pay a little bit more for a little bit longer length of time? Maybe. Um, but when it comes to custody, adultery is really not all that relevant. The only time it can be is if the cheating spouse is exposing the children to the relationship. Maybe they are using some really bad judgment and having the affair partner come over to the house when the kids are there. Um, or maybe there's somebody who is meeting a lot of different affair partners on various dating apps and exposing the children to, criminals, that sort of
Mm,
thing, then it can be relevant. But for the most part, if your spouse cheated and the child was not aware, was not, involved with the person at all, then most likely it's not going to be terribly relevant to a child custody claim. Likewise, with the property distribution. So in North Carolina, we call that equitable distribution, and all that marital property, everything that you and your spouse acquired from the day you got married until the day you separate, is going to, in most cases, be divided 50-50. Again, adultery is not going to be relevant to that division. It's still going to be 50-50 unless there's some sort of financial misconduct that you can prove.
mm.
And when I talk about financial misconduct, that's like spending money on a boyfriend or girlfriend. I mean, if somebody is whining and dining their affair partner and taking them on trips and you can prove that, then you might be able to, we say, bring that money back into the marital estate. So it's like it still exists, but it just gets distributed to the person who spent it.
Gotcha, gotcha. And back to your previous point, to our business owners in particular, again, going to some of the comments I see on some of my material that I put out there, you'll see some horrible legal advice. And one of the things that, for whatever reason, I think it's because of this popularity of like cryptocurrency and other things, where people will say that's a good way of hiding some funds. So you'll see some guy post on there. Just discovered my wife is having an affair and she's going to divorce me. I read her emails or whatever it may be. And some guy will get on there invariably and say, start shuffling money over to XYZ. And sure enough, you'll be people saying on there saying, bad idea. I wouldn't do that. I would consult with an attorney. That's showing that you're trying to hide funds, and that will look very badly upon you. I think, and you mentioned it earlier, being a business owner, entrepreneur, and having this ultimate control over the funds, what goes in and out of the business, it can be tempting to start shuffling things around and going, this is an expense that wasn't an expense before. This is payroll to this guy over here who may or may not exist, or whatever it may be. Big, big no-no. And we want to steer guys away from any kind of, what's the word, financial creativity to try and save a buck or two. Because, what's the term they use for hiring a CPA to go in there and dig through the books to try and
Forensic
find
accounting.
forensic accounting.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's a thing I've heard more than a few times, especially with entrepreneurial guys, where the ex-wife, soon to be ex-wife, will hire the forensic accountant to really dig in there and see what's going on. So you're not going to be able to hide everything. I don't care how fancy Swiss banks or whatever it is that you think you're employing there. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a paper trail most likely for any transaction. Unless you are strictly a solely cash business, odds are good that there is going to be some sort of record of money going into an account. And likewise, there's going to be another record of that money coming back out and where it went. And so even if you think that you're being creative, most likely somebody's going to be able to track that down if they're looking for it.
So how about we've wrapped this up. How about some tactical information or gotchas that people may not think of, men in particular? Maybe we want to focus in on entrepreneurial guys in particular, the gotchas that you may not know of, that you may say, why didn't anybody ever tell me this going into this? I could have been better prepared.
So I tell clients to assemble your team to help you. Divorce is one of the most stressful life events that a person can go through. And it takes a lot longer to get out of a marriage than it took to get into one. And so I say you need to have a support team in place to help you. And on that team, you want to have your attorney, You want to have a therapist, a CPA, potentially a financial planner, depending upon the case, maybe some business valuation experts if you are a business owner. And you'll have all of your advisors there to assist you with all of the different areas of family law that you're going to need to consider. CPA is a really big one. Tax consequences can jump out of nowhere in a family law case. And it's really important that you understand the tax consequences of the assets that you are asking be distributed to you. I mean, maybe you're going to keep a big investment account. Well, are you going to have some capital gains associated with that if you liquidate? Or are you going to need to liquidate? Would it be better to split that account in half with your spouse so that you're equally sharing the burden of any capital gains? Likewise with the marital residence, I see this more with my female clients than my male clients, but whoever is keeping the house needs to really consider, are they going to be there long term or are they going to be selling short term? And if they're going to be selling short term, is it better to propose that the house just be sold so that you and your spouse are equally sharing in those expenses for that sale, your realtor's commission and all of the closing costs and things? Because we'll have clients who really want to keep that marital home and they end up selling it a year or two later, and then they're the ones stuck with all of those expenses. So that's something to keep in mind.
I hear that so often. The house thing, houses, especially in America, are such an emotional thing. And I hear from so many men, I helped build this, if not build this home with my own two hands. This was a family thing. This home belonged to my grandfather and we own it outright. And we have $750,000 of equity. I'm not going to walk away from this, damn it. And it's like, yeah, I understand, but this is ones and zeros. This is a legal thing we're talking about. This is a numbers thing. Dude, can you really afford to, single-handedly, number one, hang on to a $750,000 home, 3-story home all by yourself? What does it look like long-term? Or does it just make better sense? The emotional component of this, not only in terms of clouding your judgment, but the emotional component in terms of your own mental health is a big, big thing going through this. Mm-hmm. And what stress will hanging on to such a large asset that may put a tremendous amount of pressure on your shoulders financially to keep up, to pay taxes on, et cetera, et cetera. The weight of that may outweigh the whole, emotional component of this was grandpa's house. And it's the quote unquote, we're in a battle and it's not fair that she get the home that is mine. The old, you chuckle, the whole fair thing. Hear that quite often. That doesn't factor into this, unfortunately.
No, fair is a 4-letter word when it comes to divorce.
It's a 4-letter word when it comes to divorce. Very good. And sometimes you just need to let those things go. And we've seen, and maybe your experience will say otherwise, but I've done my research on all of this, and nationwide we've seen long-term, the men tend to do better financially than the women do post-divorce. So I use that as kind of something to show men that you'll be fine. When, yes, you lost this asset, yes, you have this debt hanging over you and so forth, but my friend, if it helps to soften the blow a little bit, and especially in these contentious divorces where wife cheated and everything else, if it's a race, who's going to do better 5-10 years from now, you'll be fine, is what I tell a lot of guys. So sometimes it just means letting things go. And as far as the team aspect that you talked about, having a team, hugely, hugely important. And I will add a member to that team, which is a friend.
Absolutely.
Somebody can call on and just say, I am having a bad night. And I don't care what kind of tough, quote unquote, alpha male you think you are. This divorce thing is one of, if not the toughest thing you're going to go through in your life. And it just hits you from all angles. So you need a buddy or 2 or 3 that you can call on to say, not having a good night. This stinks. I'm sitting here. Haven't slept in a couple of days, whatever it may be. The therapist, everybody there to help you. And it's time to set your man ego aside and say, help. This sucks. And listen to your attorney. I'll end on that. Listen to your attorney. They have your best interest in mind. They're not out just to suck every last dollar out of you or whatever. A lot of language out there. I'm sure you've heard it all, where you're just there to take every last penny away from the man, grab him by the ankles and shake the last, bit of change out of his pocket. No, you're there to make sure that you have his best interest in mind. You're making sure that he comes out looking as good as possible when this is all said and done. So guys, hire an attorney, absolutely, and listen to them. So Miss Jamie Davis, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And let's end on where can people find out more about you and what you do?
So I am host of the A Year and a Day Divorce Without Destruction podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. My law firm website is divorcestough.com. So there's lots of information there. And I also have a book, same name as the podcast, A Year and a Day Divorce Without Destruction. And that's available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books.
All right, guys, let's help her out. Let's help out Miss Jamie Davis. Buy the book, subscribe, follow her podcast, and go to the website. By the way, that website, I don't know who got that domain for that website. Wow, you nailed it on that one. You could probably sell that one and make a pretty penny. That's a good one, but I would hang on to it. That's a really good one. So Miss Jamie, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right.